Chapter 27. United now in their concern for Evanlyn, the two apprentices headed for Halt's quarters. All of the Araluen party had been assigned rooms in the main hall. As Halt was their leader, he had been given a small suite of 3 rooms. At the door, Will knocked perfunctorily and heard Halt's gruff reply, "Come." As they entered, he took in the fact that Iraq was in the room with Halt. It was hard to miss the bulky Skandian. He seemed to fill most spaces he occupied. He was sprawled in one of the comfortable, carved wood armchairs that decorated the room, doubtless liberated on some wolf ship raid down the coast. Halt was standing by the window, framed against the low-angled light of the late afternoon. He looked quizzically at the doorway as the 2 boys entered hurriedly. "Halt," Will began urgently. "Horace says Evanlyn's disappeared. She's safe and sound and back in Hallisholm." A familiar voice finished the sentence for him. Both boys turned to the speaker. Standing a little back in the shadows of the room, she hadn't been evident as they'd entered. "Evanlyn!" Horace exclaimed. "You're all right!" The girl smiled. Now his eyes were accustomed to the darker part of the room. Will could make out that her face and clothes were smeared with grease and dirt. Her eyes met his, and she smiled at him, a little wistfully. Then she upended the flask of juice that she had in her hand and drank greedily from it. "Apparently," she said, setting the flask down, "although I have a thirst on me that I doubt I'll ever quench. All I've had to drink in the last 18 hours was a little rainwater that made its way through the canvas covers over the—" She hesitated and looked to Iraq to supply the word she was after. The Jarl obliged. "Forepeak," he said, and Evanlyn repeated the word. "Forepeak, exactly, of Slagor's ship," she said. Will and Horace exchanged puzzled glances. "What in the devil's name were you doing there?" Will asked, and Halt answered for her. "The devil's name is right," he said. "It seems our friend Slagor has sold out to the Temujai, and he's planning to betray Hallisholm to them." "What?" asked Will, his voice almost cracking with surprise. He looked at Evanlyn. "How do you know?" The girl shrugged her slim shoulders. "Because I heard him discussing it with the Temujai leader. They were barely 2 meters away from me." "It seems," Halt put in by way of explanation, "that your old friend Slagor sailed down the coast yesterday to a rendezvous with the Temujai Shan, one Haskam. And since our traitor obviously didn't trust his new allies too far, he insisted on all negotiations being carried out on board his ship, just to keep Haskam's retainers at a distance." "Which is how I came to hear it," Evanlyn finished. But now Horace was scratching his head in bewilderment. "But what were you doing on the ship?" he said. "I told you," Evanlyn replied, "eavesdropping on Slagor and the Temujai." Horace made an impatient gesture. Yes, so you've said, but why were you there in the first place?" Evanlyn went to answer, hesitated, then stopped altogether. All eyes in the room were on her now, and she realized she didn't really have a logical answer to that question. I don't know," she said finally. "I was bored, I guess, and feeling useless. I was looking for something to do. And besides, Slagor looked sort of shifty." "Slagor always looks sort of shifty," Iraq put in, helping himself to fruit from a bowl on the table in front of him. Evanlyn thought about it, then conceded the point. "Well, that's true, I suppose, but he looked even shiftier than usual," she said. "So I decided someone had better keep an eye on him and see what he was up to." Truth be told, Evanlyn was quite enjoying herself now. She had gone from feeling useless and unnecessary to being the bearer of important, even vital news to Halt and Iraq. She couldn't help preening, just a little. Horace's next reaction was exactly what she'd hoped for. "But you could have been spotted. What if they'd found you there? They would have killed you," he said, his concern for her evident in the worried tone of his voice. That thought had occurred to Evanlyn on more than one occasion, as she'd crouched in the damp space in the bow of the wolf ship. Once she had fully realized the situation she was in, her skin had crawled with the fear of discovery with every second. But now she affected a nonchalant air about the entire episode. "I suppose so, but let's face it, someone had to do it." She was delighted to notice that Horace was looking at her with something approaching awe. She glanced quickly at Will, hoping to see the same look of admiration there. His next words dashed that hope. "All very well," he said dismissively, "but the important thing is that Slagor is planning to betray us. How is he aiming to do it?" "That's the point, of course," Halt agreed. He indicated a chart of the Skandian coast that he and Iraq had spread on the table between them. "Apparently, friend Slagor plans to put to sea quietly the day after tomorrow and make for the same rendezvous point down the coast. Only this time, there'll be 150 Temujai warriors waiting. He'll take them aboard and ferry them back here to Hallisholm." "He'll never fit 150 men into one wolf ship," Will interrupted. Halt nodded. "Apparently, he has 2 other ships waiting for him out behind this island, halfway to the rendezvous." "They left a week ago," Iraq put in. "Supposedly, they were going to raid behind the Temujai lines. It seems the Skrulls are in league with Slagor, and they're waiting at this pre-arranged point." He tapped the map with his dagger, with which he'd been peeling fruit. A few spots of apple juice fell onto the parchment. Halt raised an eyebrow at him and wiped them away as the Jarl continued. "With 3 ships, they'll carry 150 men easily." "Then what?" Horace asked. Evanlyn, piqued that attention had been diverted from her and that Will had ignored the danger she'd been in, leapt back into the conversation. "They'll be able to attack our forces from the rear," she explained. "Think of it, 150 men with the element of surprise suddenly appearing behind our lines." "That could be very nasty indeed," Horace said thoughtfully. "So what do we do?" "We've already taken the first step," Iraq told him. "I've sent Svengel with 2 of my ships out to Falcork Island here." Again he tapped the juice-stained knife on the map, and again Halt raised his eyes at him. "To make sure Slagor's other 2 ships don't keep any rendezvous." 2 against 2, Will asked. "Is that enough?" The Jarl cocked his head to one side and smiled at him. "Count yourself lucky that Svengel wasn't here to hear you say that," he replied. "He'd consider his crew alone to be more than a match for 2 ships full of Slagor's followers. But in fact, Slagor's ships will only have rowing crews. They'll need all the space they have to cram those Temujai on board with them." "But what do we do about Slagor?" Will asked, and this time it was Halt who answered. "That's the problem. If he gets wind that we know what he's up to, he'll simply abandon the plan. We'll be able to prove nothing. It'll be his word against the word of a former slave, and an escaped one at that." He smiled at Evanlyn to show he meant no insult, but was merely stating the facts. She nodded her understanding. "But if Slagor finds the other 2 ships at this island, surely that's proof," Horace interjected, and Halt shook his head. "Proof of what? The crews will hardly admit they were waiting to go fetch the Temujai," he said. Horace sat back, frowning. This was getting too complicated for him. Then what can we do? Will asked. But at that moment there was a heavy knock at the door. They all looked at each other in surprise. The clandestine nature of their discussion had made them speak in lowered tones, and the sudden interruption had made them all start guiltily, as if discovered. "Anyone expecting visitors?" Halt asked, and as the others shook their heads, he called once more, "Come." The door opened to admit Hodak, one of Irak's younger followers. He glanced around the room, noting the identities of all present. He looked uncomfortable as he noticed Evanlyn. "Thought I might find you here," he said to Irak. "Ragnak's calling a special council in the Great Hall. He wants you there, Jarl." He indicated Evanlyn, "and you'd better bring the girl with you." "Evanlyn? Why should she go?" Halt asked. He saw the girl shrink back from the young Skandian. Maybe she had some premonition of what was to come. "The council's about her," Hodak said awkwardly. "Slagor has invoked Ragnak's Valethvow. He says the girl is really Princess Cassandra, daughter of King Duncan.